Right, so after a good bit of searching around and a lot of messaging and digging, I have apparently managed to get a hold of China's exclusive 8GB GTX 750 Ti. That's right, over in China, they are getting around all of the prices going up by still re-releasing the 750 Ti with 8 gigs of VRAM. Now, I have no clue if this is legit. I'm hoping it is because the guy that's managed to import it for me has provided us with 2 GT 1010s and also an RTX 4010, which was a very strange card, but he has apparently managed to source me this. So why don't we get this open and see just what's going on, because I have no clue why this is real, but apparently it is. Well, we've got some foam, and we have a box. What is being revealed to us here? The X-Game gaming graphics card, multi-display outputs, accelerated calculation, virtual reality. Will it be able to do that? Middle-Z graphics cards are made of selected materials, and it can do 4K. Right, what's actually inside? This is what actually matters. We have the card, some screws, I'm guessing for mounting the card in the PC. That's nice. Let's get it open. And it is the GTX 750 Ti 8GB DDR5 128-bit 4 RAM chips here, more RAM chips there. It does look like it could have 8 gigs of VRAM. Everything else online's been telling me this is a scam, so the fact this could be real, very exciting. Do we get anything else? We get our query sheet with bits like components are lifting off, fins are deformed, there are burrs on the edges of the PCB, the anti-tamper stick has fingerprints. They've got a performance section, and the graphics card power could be lower than expected is blamed on the fact that your computer is bad. Nice! I don't know how applicable our 2-year warranty is given that I've imported this, but hey. Oh, we do actually get the quality assurance card, so we have to get the latest official cards from the Nvidia website, and it is compatible with a Pentium 4, a Celeron, an Athlon, or a Sempron. But also it needs DDR3 and DDR4. Technically you can run a Pentium 4 on DDR3, so I'll accept it. We also need Adobe Reader, apparently. Well, hey, let's plug this in and see exactly what it does, because to my understanding, this could be fake. I mean, it's a bit of a basic looking card, but it doesn't seem badly put together. It's got a VGA port, it's got HDMI, it doesn't need any 6-pin. They've left the traces for a 6-pin on it, so maybe they do sell a better version than this, or probably just a leftover from another PCB they make. But yeah, let's get this plugged in. I am dead curious to see if it's fake or if they are genuinely just salvaging old 750 Ti chips and then reselling them. HDMI is in. What does it do? There's no RGB. I really hope it does work, because it has cost me about £50 after importing one of these, which isn't terrible, but it's still a good chunk of money. We do get a display. A display, though, is not going to be the real test of this. It's going to be putting drivers on it, running it through 3D Mark, seeing if it overclocks, and seeing how it compares to a real 750 Ti, because for most titles, the 2 gigs that a normal 750 Ti comes with wasn't really a bottleneck. It's only in the latest titles where we saw, okay, yeah, you really are running out. Okay, it has detected that this is, well, at least a graphics card supported by these drivers, but we've seen them get around this before, so hopefully this isn't a complete scam. I mean, if they've sent me some sort of Fermi rebrand still in the year of 2026, I mean, I don't know whether to be impressed at the audacity of it or to just downright cry. Well, it has, in fact, installed drivers, so I suppose we'll let it restart and then see what it's actually telling us this card is. So I've let the computer restart, and it's now time to find out just what it actually is. I actually don't know. No one really covers these things, because why would you? GPU-Z is open. It's 750 Ti, GM107, that is all correct. 8 gigs of GDDR5 Hynix memory running through a 128-bit memory bus. 16 ROPs, 32 TMUs, 512 shaders. 512 shaders sounds low. It's not quite got the full amount of shaders. It should have more. So it's looking like it's cut down slightly. GM107, everything else checks out absolutely fine. So maybe it's a laptop chip or a cut down version, but it does apparently have 8 gigs of memory according to GPU-Z. But the thing is, GPU-Z is not always correct. It can be tricked, as we've seen many times before. The big test will be running it through something like Steel Nomad, which of course is going to be pushing 8 gigs of VRAM very hard and will run at single digits, it'll run at like 0.2 FPS on a normal 750 Ti because it doesn't have enough VRAM. But But this could be the solution. Well, we're here in 3D Mark, 750 Ti, 8 gigabytes. It's clocked at just north of a gigahertz. I don't know what it's going to boost up to. And this is the first time I've ever put a GTX 750 Ti in my system, and it tells us to run the latest benchmark. So, you know what? We will start with Steel Nomad. I don't know how this will run, because surely it doesn't have the power out of the box to run it. I mean, I can understand why they would make this. It must cost them very little to get hold of the actual GM107. I don't know where they're sourcing it from, but I'm guessing not your conventional 750 Ti's. Maybe laptops, maybe a cut-down chip, maybe something like that. Maybe it's just a rebranded 750, which I can't remember the specs off the top of my head, but it lines up more or less from what I remember. It is up to 5 gigs of VRAM usage, and is running at about 2.5 frames per second, which is actually not bad. I mean, it's at 100% utilization, it's an old card, but it does have the VRAM to actually brute force its way through this very slowly. I'm curious what's going to happen if we go up to the full 8 gigabytes, because why does it have 8 gigs? Legendary. The best score ever, apparently, for this. Probably because no one has bothered to track down or benchmark an 8 gig 750 Ti. This may be the first result. How stable is it? It's very cold. It gets up to 42 degrees and has perfectly stable GPU clocks. It clocks up to around just shy of 1200 megahertz. There might be overclocking headroom. So it's not actually using a 750 Ti die, it is using a cut down and then boosted up GTX 750 die. So I was on the right wavelength thinking about it. I mean, that's still 247 is still a very respectable score for a 750. Well, they've done it. I mean, we need to test a game and max out the VRAM. I'll try and launch something and see what it does. What we'll do is we'll just set everything down to low, other than the texture quality, which will turn right up to high. They've made a 750 Ti of sorts using nothing but VRAM and clock speed, and scrapped GPU dies off they're probably laptop chips, to be honest. I mean, it's not playable, and it's still only using 4 gigs of the VRAM available, but it does make me wonder. I mean, we've got so much VRAM left over. I mean, FSR's got some overhead. Should we whack FSR on it as well? See what it does? I mean, it might bring it up to a playable level. It's pushed up VRAM usage and has gained us a few more frames, which is about what I expected. So I suppose that's one advantage, is you now have enough VRAM to be able to deal with the overheads of FSR and scaling a bit easier. I suppose my other question is, does it overclock? What have they even used to put this together? Sizable uplift in performance, uses a bit more VRAM. It's something. I mean, for what it is, even out of the box as a baseline score, it is set up really well. I mean, it is just slightly beneath the average for a 750 Ti, but that's not actually what this card is, so I kind of get why they're selling it as one. I suppose we find out how good the silicon they're using is, because I don't want to say it's going to be that good, but we don't get any voltage controls, we get no other controls. We can increase a temp limit, but it's nowhere near it. So what if we do an extra 150 on core? Okay, 300 is too much. They're using good silicon, but not great. Okay, 550 is the limit, so we can probably do about 500 megahertz on memory and 250 on core. The core makes sense. That's about average for a 750 or 750 Ti, whatever this really is. The memory, surprisingly good, because it is modern Hynix memory. So we'll restart this, dial back in the overclocks, see what it does, and then we're pretty much ready to start testing. Oh, this is now the best score ever. All I've done is buy the thing. Well, it is actually top of the leaderboard. I mean, all we've done is plug it in and give it the slightest overclock, but that is because this is actually a GTX 750, not a Ti. So the fact is they've just really boosted the clocks as high as they go. I pushed them even further, and then, well, the last time people were benchmarking this with the Ryzen 7, which is where these results come from, was 2022, or some guy did it in 2025 in Germany, but none of them were using this one. So, pretty good, actually. They've done a decent job. But why don't we wait for some stuff to update and actually crack on with some real benchmarking. So yes, it does appear that China has made a GTX 750 Ti that is their own weird 8GB creation. Now, calling it a Ti is definitely a little bit untruthful, because this appears to be either a laptop chip or one of the lower grade GTX 750 non-Ti chips, which has then been grafted onto a new PCB and given 8 gigs of RAM. Unfortunately, given its origins, despite the fact I have a relatively good importer that managed to source this, and all I've been able to find out is this is something that is local to certain areas of China and will cost them around £30 over there to just go out and buy. So I can kind of already understand the value prospect. You're getting essentially GTX 750 Ti performance because of all the overclocks it comes with out of the box, but with 8 gigs of VRAM on there, probably just because it'll sell. I mean, the same marketing strategy works here. People will buy lower grade cards if they come with more memory, and I don't doubt that changes when you move over to the east, so that's my only reasoning there. Other than that, I can find out very little about these. So if you do know more, please do leave a comment. The only reason I know these existed is because someone said they'd heard about them existing, and then that got me digging, and then within 3 months I did actually manage to get a hold of one. So yeah, for 50 quid, it is, for me, an expensive 750 Ti with too much VRAM, but what exactly are the specifications? Well, being a GTX 750 Ti in quotation marks, it is based on the GM107 architecture, which was Maxwell on 28nm. You do have a true 8GB of GDDR5 memory. This isn't a flash, this isn't firmware, this is real physical memory that is on there. It has a 128-bit memory bus, you still get bug fixes and security updates from Nvidia, 512 pixel shaders, 32 ROP, 16 TMUs, which is lower than a real 750 Ti, but they have bumped the clock speed up to match it, and it was released in 2026. It might have been slightly earlier than this, but it seems to have come to the mass market over there this year, with the memory crisis and all PC parts going up through the roof. It uses around 40 watts under full load, and is about £30 or $50 in its native markets. After import fees and actually getting someone to source it for me, it cost me around 50 quid. When it comes to the actual synthetic scores of this very weird card, it's actually set up pretty well out of the box, scoring 1062 in 3DMark's TimeSpy. Overclocking this was relatively easy, the memory is pretty new so it goes quite high, the core is mediocre, it's your standard GM107 core that's been grafted onto a new PCB. But we did see around 200 extra points, which is a solid 20% uplift, or in and around that mark, so you can't really argue with it too much. In terms of comparison to a real 750 Ti, this is an Asus variant that we looked at a couple of months ago, which is one with a 6-pin, so does run higher clocks out of the box and has a higher power limit, not that it really needs it, and as we can see, when overclocked it does match a pretty much stock 750 Ti, which is pretty good and likely the reason they're going with that name. When you actually compare the overclock against a properly overclocked 750 Ti, once again one with a 6-pin power plug, so not exactly a like-for-like comparison, it does begin to fall behind slightly. When we compare it against lots of other graphics cards though, and it's pretty much exactly where you'd expect to be in a benchmark of its era with TimeSpy. Even then, this is still a bit of a new benchmark for a card like this because, well, it's TimeSpy, it's DirectX 12, and this is a Maxwell architecture. So it's somewhere between a Vega 7 and an overclocked 750 Ti. Sort of makes sense. The one area it does begin to pull ahead though is in the latest and greatest titles, and I'm going to represent this with Steel Nomad, where we went from 82 points on your normal 750 Ti up to 292 points, which is a huge uplift, but still places it right at the bottom of the graph, behind even 4GB cards like the RX 580 and the R9 Fury Nano. Then again, of course, we look at a progression of how it gets on across synthetic testing. DirectX 10 titles work fantastically, DirectX 11 works pretty good too, and this is the only bit that's a little bit weird. We saw Steel Nomad Lite, which is meant to be more reminiscent of more optimized DirectX 12 games of this current era we're in, actually performed better than TimeSpy, which is likely because we do actually have 8 gigs of VRAM, as opposed to the usual 2 to 4 you'd usually get in this sort of era. And then of course you have Steel Nomad down at the end, with 292 points. Now this really is a tricky card to test because, well, we've already established it is real, within reason. Yes, the naming is a bit funny, but at the same time, it is still what was a mid-range card from 2014, which is now 12 years old, and don't get me wrong, I was very impressed when I took a look back at the 750 Ti, but VRAM wasn't really much of a problem there. So having what is now 4 times as much VRAM available on a card with similar power, I really don't know where it's going to be utilised. So I've gone through and I've done the benchmark suite and I've tried to take advantage of the VRAM where possible, because in a lot of titles having this much VRAM available does mean that you can use higher quality textures with minimal to no performance hit. Some titles were a bit worse, but generally you could get away with it. So I've tried to use up as much of the VRAM as possible, but it is a very tricky card to try and fill up that VRAM pool without resulting in single-digit frame rates because, well, the card itself can't handle it. I mean, the reason this exists is an anomaly. Anyway, it's time we find out. Is the 750 Ti, or the 750, or whatever you want to call this, whatever this actually is, with 8GB of VRAM, enough for gaming in 2026? And have the Chinese actually gone ahead and made a new budget wonder that we should all be trying to go and get a hold of? Or is this purely a marketing ploy that we've seen done time and time again? Just this time it's not a scam, it is actually real. Anyway, there's only one way to find out, and that is with the benchmarks. Starting things off, and this was immediately where I knew things were going to be very odd, because we've got GTA 5 Enhanced Edition here, and usually what we do on cards of this era, because we're usually testing the cheaper, higher end ones, is we'd sort of try and mask the lower quality textures with higher quality effects. Whereas here, we're doing the opposite, because we have tons of VRAM and no power, so what we're doing is we're trying to mask lower quality effects with normal settings with the highest quality texture options in a nice 1080p resolution. And to be fair, it looked and ran okay, and frame times were exceptionally decent, with 52 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 46 FPS, so if there is one advantage it does have, it is really rather solid frame times, which did extend to areas with high draw distances, like when you're flying or doing bits and pieces like that. It all worked absolutely fine. Moving into the world of online, which is slightly more VRAM intensive, even with the Enhanced Edition, and with the exact same settings, we saw our average now drop down to 48 FPS, with 1% lows down to 41 FPS. So the VRAM still helps out, but unfortunately just lacking in power in a busy lobby did result in a slightly lower average, which isn't something we usually see, but does make sense given the context of the card. Not that I want to do too many legacy benchmarks, because let's be honest, if it is a game from this era, it was designed to peak out around 2 to 4 GB in terms of VRAM usage, so having 8 GB will prove absolutely nothing at all. GTA 5 Legacy running with high and then very high textures, which is how the game set itself up. I'm assuming it does detect that we've got 8 gigs of VRAM and goes with standard 750 Ti settings, but then turns our texture quality up to ultra because, well, it can see it's got headroom. That's the only reasoning I've got here. Games are a bit weird with trying to configure this card because it knows what a 750 Ti is because they were very popular. But seeing it has 8 gigs of VRAM tries to make some games do things that you wouldn't expect them to do, but GTA 5 was fine for that. We returned 38 FPS on average, with once again very solid frame times down to 1% lows of 33 FPS, and it pretty much played exactly how I'd expect it to on a GTX 750 or 750 Ti. Moving over into the world of online though, where the legacy version is still a bit of a mess with optimization and utilization, well, having the extra VRAM did help here. Usually we'd see a substantial dip in our overall average and our 1% lows, but having that 8GB buffer certainly helped with spikes. Admittedly, it didn't fix utilization, that was still all over the place, but we saw our average drop down by 1 frame per second, and our 1% lows stayed exactly the same. So it is worth including this as a benchmark because GTA Online Legacy does actually benefit from having 8 gigs of VRAM. It's a very small improvement, but hey, it is an improvement nonetheless. But what about competitive games? What about Counter-Strike, for example? Well, with Counter-Strike 2 running competitive settings, which is low everything and dynamic shadows enabled, but with high textures enabled because it made zero difference to our overall frame rate in a 1080p resolution, and we returned 98 FPS on average, and it must be said, Counter-Strike 2 can be a bit of a VRAM hog, so it did actually help out with the overall stability of our frame rate, with 1% lows down to 77 FPS. So overall, in simpler maps and scenarios, yes, having 8 gigs of RAM might not benefit the overall average, but it does help out with those frame times slightly. It was noticeably smoother to play here than I was expecting for a 750 or 750 Ti, and it purely is the fact we have 8 gigs of frame buffer available if it ever needs it. Moving into some of those newer maps though, and we run into a couple of problems. namely the fact that the 750 Ti that we tested a couple of months ago was already struggling, and having a card that is cut down from there, it really does struggle. So this was in the newer version of cache, and we saw our average now drop down to 48 FPS, with 1% lows down to 39 FPS. The only way to improve this wasn't to lower settings further, it would be to lower the resolution. It was controllable with good frame times, but having VRAM doesn't make up for the fact that this card is ultimately not very powerful. Moving on to Cyberpunk, which we did actually take a little bit of a look at earlier, and it must be said there are some advantages to having this much VRAM. Now, most people look at FSR as a solution to getting those frame rates higher, but the reality is, for a lot of us that are on these older cards, they will know that it does incur a VRAM penalty, so sometimes you'll end up with worse performance because you're utilising it. And that is an advantage this 8GB card has. With so much VRAM left over, well, you can enable things like FSR, and it doesn't ruin your frame rate, it does actually help. So Cyberpunk was playable with low settings and high textures. I did dabble with the texture quality, and to be fair, it's about 1 or 2 frames difference. It made very little to no change here, so I left them on high. But we did utilise 720p with an FSR set to balance mode, and this returned us a relatively playable 34 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 26 FPS. Generally, when not much was going on, you'd see anywhere from 40 to 45 FPS, but this was taken from a mixture of general gameplay and heavy action, because during heavy action, the game will fluctuate between 25 to 35 FPS, but overall, this was more controllable and more playable than how I remember it was on the 750 Ti. So Cyberpunk does get an advantage here, but it's only because you now have a card that's capable of dealing with the overheads of FSR. Then again, you could also get a 4GB 750 Ti, which would likely return the exact same frame rate. BeamNG proved to be an interesting one here because we had to use a mixture of low and medium settings with textures turned up to high. The advantage of having this much VRAM though wasn't so much the actual texture quality and bits and pieces like that, it's that as you spawn in more traffic, this game can use a lot more VRAM than you'd expect, especially in some of those more intensive maps like how we usually do it with the jungle. So I enabled traffic and we had a 900p resolution, and it was nice to see that enabling traffic really didn't make too much of a dent in the frame rate. I know a lot of people look at it as the strain on the processor, but on these lower end cards, enabling traffic fills up the VRAM quite quickly and can quite quickly become a challenge. So having 8GB of it here, well, it doesn't make too much of a difference to how the game looks, but it does mean you can have more traffic on the map, which is a very, well, it's actually quite a gameplay focused setting to turn on, really, so I have to give them credit here. It doesn't change how the game looks or runs, but it does mean you can enjoy the game more, if that makes sense. It's actually more relevant for the gameplay itself than the overall visuals. Baldur's Gate 3 is always an interesting one to test, especially on an Nvidia card. Now, there's always countless problems testing this on AMD, so when we do have the rarity of testing Nvidia, we're doing a lot more of that this year, I've got a stack of cards out there to test, and it was interesting to see that the game had already defaulted itself to low settings, but with ultra textures, so I'm assuming this game purely does decide texture quality based on the VRAM pool available. So I ran the game with these settings, and it was playable with 32 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 26 FPS. And the strangest thing was, the textures actually looked really nice in places, but then a lot of the effects just looked downright hideous on their lowest settings. So it was this strange mixture of when you were pressed right up against a texture, you thought, oh, that looks alright, but the moment there was any shadows, effects, battles, combat, they would take quite a heavy toll on the performance because the card can't keep up with them, but at least the actual static picture in the background could look okay. So Baldur's Gate 3, bit of a weird one, but it now ekes out 30ish FPS, provided you don't mind 720p, low settings, and ultra textures. Now, Red Dead Redemption 2 was also an interesting one. Usually, as most people know, I hate benchmarking this game because it is a nightmare to change settings when you don't have much VRAM. But now we are in the opposite scenario where the game can't really muster much more than low settings and a 720p resolution, but we have full control of the settings menu because we have, of course, 8 gigs of VRAM. The game did default to ultra textures, but I did turn everything else down to low because otherwise it was a slideshow. But other than this, it was really quite playable. It was a slightly nicer looking, slightly better running version of what you'd expect to see on an Xbox One, which makes sense, we've got about that level of power, but more VRAM available, so we could have nicer textures, but a similar level of effects and resolution. So Red Dead Redemption 2 pretty much worked perfectly fine, just you were only getting nice quality textures and everything else down to its lowest. Well, not quite the lowest, but pretty much near it. Next up we had Arc Raiders, which was a bit of an interesting one to launch because usually on a card of this era you get 2 messages when you launch it. 1, this card is not supported, and 2, you don't have enough VRAM. And that's pretty much across the board because this game expects around 4 to 6 gigs minimum, but of course we're going into this with a card that's too weak and 8 gigs of VRAM, which it deems plenty. So we ran the game with low settings and ultra textures in 900p with FSR sets to balance mode because once again, with this VRAM implementation, you can easily handle those overheads, and to be fair, if you weren't interested in running FSR, you could get a similar frame rate to this in 720p with a native resolution and no upscaling, so it's really your choice. Really, this game does benefit from FSR, it makes everything look a little bit less jaggy, so that's the reason I went for it. And it ran perfectly fine with 45 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 37 FPS. Now, Arc Raiders is really good about dynamically allocating what textures will be loaded in, so it was nice to see the game decide to load in absolutely everything on a 750 Ti. Trees were no longer blobs and sort of things that merged towards you. The ground was all there, the trees were all there, the foliage was all there, and to be fair, a really solid experience, which you don't get on the lower VRAM versions of this card. The thing is though, what about those popular titles like Fortnite? Well, most people are playing it anyway with performance mode and performance textures and just everything on its lowest for visibility. But here, just because we can, I ran it with performance mode and high textures, because you can and there's no performance hit whatsoever. So it actually did put a little bit more load on the card and it felt a little bit smoother with these higher textures, but then again you could just cap the frame rate and get a similar effect if you were just interested in having everything on performance mode. We returned 98 FPS on average, with once again remarkably solid frame times down to 1% lows of 81 FPS. And that's one area I do believe the 8 gigs of VRAM is actually helping out. Despite not always being a readable, it's not something you can quantify with the frame times, because the 750 Ti is capable of good frame times here as well, but the game does feel ever so slightly smoother, and maybe it's just in micro stuttering and bits and pieces that metric software can't pick up. Having 8 gigabytes of it there just felt a bit more stable. Maybe it's because there are sudden VRAM spikes, that's a very common thing in Unreal Engine, so I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case, but having 8 gigs of it does help the game's feel, if anything. I know it's a very anecdotal way of wording it, but I felt that the game was a little bit smoother. Then again, the figures also do indicate that it was a very smooth experience. If there's one game that does benefit from these higher VRAM cards, it's the anniversary update to Fallout 4, so it's a good one to go back and revisit, because it does now perform better on these older cards, provided they have the VRAM to deal with how the game wants to run. We ran it with the medium preset and ultra textures enabled in a 1080p resolution. And to be fair, this game does benefit from ultra quality textures. It helps make everything look a little bit less blurry and muddy and sort of splodged together, and the card deals with it fine. I mean, the Nvidia cards of the era always dealt with this pretty well, but with the anniversary update, those lower VRAM cards are now struggling. So with the 8 gigs now grafted onto this, it does appear that it does help out, returning 57 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 51 FPS. I mean, it's very similar to a normal 750 Ti, but those sort of lag spikes you get between transitioning into areas, they were over in sort of 2 or 3 seconds, rather than the 10 to 15 it can be on a normal card. In an attempt to run some modern titles, I launched up Hitman. I wasn't going to have it in the benchmark suite, given it is one that really does benefit from cards that deal with DirectX 12 well, and despite Maxwell dealing with it okay, it felt like this was a bit of a cruel one to do. but performance here was actually rather surprising. With low settings plus ultra textures in 720p, we were also using the base mode for simulation, we returned an average of 54 FPS, with 1% lows down to 44 FPS through the newer built-in benchmark, which is the Dartmoor benchmark map. And to be fair, this was a much better result than I was expecting. Yes, it did require a 720p resolution, and yes, higher quality settings are just something the GM107 is not capable of doing, but with those 8 gigs of VRAM, you can mask a lot of these with ultra quality textures, which is the opposite of what I'd usually say, where we'd be running the game with higher quality settings but low textures, but I'm getting away with myself here. Either way, it looked okay, it ran okay, and was a better showing than I was expecting. Mount & Blade Bannerlord was a bit of an interesting one because, once again, this game sort of chooses how it wants to run out of the box and seems to have a configuration for every card. And I'm not saying it knew what the 750 Ti 8GB was, but out of the box it wants to run with lower settings, but ultra textures and ultra quality texture streaming options, which brings it up to an average around 6GB of VRAM usage, and it had also increased the battle size. So I'm assuming it does increase battle size based on the VRAM amount it knows is available, unless someone out there that made this game, knowing them and how optimized it is, I wouldn't be surprised if they have a configuration specifically for this abomination. But with these settings that it chooses out of the box, it returned pretty much nearly 60 FPS on average, with 57 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 43 FPS. Once again, this built-in benchmark is rather reminiscent of the late game, so through a lot of the early to mid-game, this is a solid 60 FPS experience, and a lot of the ultra-quality textures and the larger battle size is down to the fact you now have 8 gigs of VRAM available, which does actually help out here. But I have finally found the one title that does actually benefit from these 8 gigs of VRAM. S&Box, or Sandbox, can run with low settings and high quality textures in 720p, and in the remake of the Office map, we returned 32 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 21 FPS. Now, whether that's because this game really does need some optimizations, we've got a video that went out last week where we got it running on 1GB of VRAM and it was a nightmare to get it running like that, but having 8 gigs here, the game spikes out at 7.8 gigs of usage loading the map in, which on lower VRAM cards can actually cause a crash. So these 8 gigs do actually help you get in game, but you're looking at a 30 FPS 720p experience because of this. So I suppose we have to give the 8 gigs a win here, but it's not in a particularly optimized title, and one that definitely has its quirks when it comes to loading in assets. But finally, can it run Crysis Remastered? Well, it can, with low settings, and the textures turned up to, I've written down as epic because I can't fit them in otherwise, but with these settings that are called Can It Run Crysis, which is as high as the texture quality can go. And to be fair, I was amazed at how optimized it was in terms of the VRAM usage, because I don't doubt you could have run this like this on a 4GB 750 Ti, but then again, that's sort of what you'd be doing. At the same time, it returned 38 FPS on average, 1% lows down to 31 FPS, and actually looked pretty decent. Crysis Remastered with low settings doesn't actually look too terrible, and the epic quality textures do look nice in certain places, especially the insides of vehicles and places like that. So Crysis Remastered does get a few benefits from 8 gigs of VRAM, but it's not exactly the most amazing thing in the world. It's just nicer quality textures, at which point, it's a 750 or 750 Ti. They deal with DirectX 9 and DirectX 10 so well that you could sort of just play the original Crysis if you wanted to. So overall performance of the 8GB 750 or 750 Ti, whatever you want to call it, and it's a bit interesting. As I already said earlier, it's a bit like the opposite of what we usually do, where we mask lower quality textures because we've got limited VRAM with nicer quality effects. The only thing is though, you've got a card that can't handle any of those higher quality effects, but can handle the higher quality textures. So you end up with a very weird looking aesthetic where most of the game looks terrible, but the textures actually don't look too bad. There are a few obvious standouts. Sandbox will actually now work properly, which is something. From as I understand it, the game needs a bit more development before people are actively going to be playing it. And then you've got things like BeamNG, where it directly affects the gameplay because you can handle more traffic without the frame rate tanking, which is ultimately very nice. Another one I would go out and say is Arc Raiders, where it does have a good way of dealing with lower VRAM cards out of the box, but what it means is you can handle FSR easier, and you can of course handle the ultra quality textures without the game being sort of a muddy pile that you walk into and wait 5 minutes for a tree to actively load in. I mean, other than that though, Counter-Strike 2 and Fortnite maybe with slightly smoother frame times in places, but that's about it. Generally, across most games, you're not really going to be noticing much of a change. I mean, it's slightly better with loading, it's slightly better with compatibility, and I can understand that if you're paying 30 quid for one of these off the shelf, that having those as advantages is nice. You've got up-to-date drivers, and you do have a lot of titles that will still work on it. The problem is, it is still a Maxwell-era card. Most games that would take advantage of those 8GB, take any new Unreal Engine 5 title that's not the ones we've tested, so Oblivion Remastered, Samson, titles like that, you will get the same generic, you don't have the right level of Vulkan or DirectX 12 support, which is entirely fair, this is a Maxwell-era card, but the titles that would get an advantage from these 8GB architecturally will not even launch on this very graphics card, leaving you with this very interesting predicament. I did go ahead and actually take a look into the Nvidia drivers to see what they do, and the Nvidia app does work correctly, everything on the card works correctly, and the drivers do correctly identify the card not as a 750 Ti as GPU-Z reports back, but as the GTX 750, which is what this card actually is. So it could either be a mobile-based GM107 chip that's been flashed, or it could just be literally a GTX 750 chip that's been beefed up with higher clocks. Either way, it does come close to a stock 750 Ti, so I'm not too upset about them calling it that, but it is a tad misleading. Other features of the card do work for media playback, so if you wanted to launch a game and then use the Nvidia overlay for performance metrics or any of the other additional features that do still work on Maxwell, such as Nvidia's NVENC recording via Shadowplay, then yeah, that does actually work. It's not exactly the best encoder in the world, but it does have a decent degree of performance, and it means you can get away with it. So yeah, it does work like a graphics card. There's no funny business going on there. All the Nvidia driver side features work, it does detect it as something that you didn't actually buy, but performance is close enough to it that can you really be annoyed? Let's be honest, if you actually know much about graphics cards, you'd know they never made an 8GB version of the 750 Ti, so there was bound to be something slightly sketchy going on. So yeah, I mean, it works as a graphics card, it's stable, it doesn't crash, and it handles overclocks well, and the driver side features do in fact work. There are a couple of other things people are likely going to be interested in, because, well, you can use a card like this over on Linux. I did change over to my other M2 SSD, which runs CatchyOS, and it works and will install the latest Nvidia drivers available for Maxwell. Now, unfortunately, being a Maxwell-based card, it means Linux side support is mediocre at best. You can launch a lot of older OpenGL titles and programs with no problems whatsoever, but Vulkan side support is a bit bad. I mean, performance isn't exactly great. You can work around it with Proton tweaks, which is what I had to do to launch Counter-Strike Go, as I spoofed the card to tell it that it's not actually an Nvidia card, which is something that apparently is quite common and something you have to do on Nvidia cards. I'm sure there are a lot of people out there that are more accustomed to running these older cards, at least these older Nvidia cards, on Linux than me, but I was able to get it to boot up fine, it was stable, the drivers did work, and you could use it for a display adapter, and you could use it for a bit of light gaming. I mean, really, you'd be best to sticking to the OpenGL renderer, like I said, but you can get away with Proton just about functioning on it. I'd imagine having the additional VRAM would help out with overhead slightly, but then again, the underlying architecture, once again, is so old that it can't really take advantage of it. I'm sure there's probably a couple of niche workstation tasks, maybe video rendering or compute tasks, that could take advantage of it, but at that point, I'm sure there's other cards in this price range you could buy that would deal with it better, but you can get away with using it on Linux. The thing is, though, there was a more interesting question people had, which was, can it work on Windows XP? Now, originally this was going to be a complete live section that I'd edited down, but unfortunately, like the idiot I am, I forgot to actually plug the microphone end into my camera. so the audio is virtually unintelligible, so I'm just going to recount it this way. Long story short, I actually have a somewhat modern computer running Windows XP. It's the £1 PC we got from the boot fair last week or a couple of weeks ago, and it was just completely filthy. It had living insects in it. Honestly, the video that came out of that was absolutely fantastic, but it did come running a period-accurate 2008 install of Windows XP, complete with bloatware, viruses, BonziBuddy, about 3 different forms of AVG, and then Dutch versions of antivirus on top of that. Long story short, a very balked install of Windows XP, but completely authentic. And, fortunately, it's running Sandy Bridge as well, which just adds to the oddity of all this, but it does mean we can simply insert the 750 Ti and install drivers. Now, Maxwell, oddly enough, does have final drivers for Windows XP, but I wasn't quite sure if these were going to work on, well, this abomination of a card, because there's a couple of things. One, this 750 Ti was made a long time after your average 750 Ti was. And also, on a 32-bit install of Windows XP, how is it going to address 8 gigs of memory, and can it even do it? So I did manage to get some drivers installed, and that all went relatively smoothly. I mean, BonziBuddy had crashed and was actually sitting on top of the installer, preventing us from seeing the progress, but other than that, one restart later, and the desktop was in a 1080p resolution, and according to GPU-Z, it was actually now detecting it as a GTX 750, not a 750 Ti, so I'm guessing Windows XP, or at least the older drivers, do know what they're dealing with here, and it was detecting 8 whole gigabytes of VRAM, which was a surprise. Now, according to DXDiag, only 4 gigabytes of this is actually applicable to the operating system, but the very fact alone that this was able to even realize it had 8 gigs of VRAM on a 32-bit install of Windows XP just seemed absolutely insane to me. Now, there are a couple of games installed on this PC. There's Jimmy White's Cue Ball 2, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, but I did actually add Crysis myself. So I went through and launched up Crysis, put it up to the highest settings possible in DirectX 9, and it runs flawlessly. And genuinely, we were getting anywhere from sort of 30 to 60 FPS, with lots of the limit not actually being this graphics card, it was the Sandy Bridge Core i5 in the system, because it's got strong IPC, but it's not exactly good enough for Crysis. Really, you want this bumped up by a whole gigahertz or so if you want to be getting a constant 60 FPS. But anyway, that's besides the point. It ran perfectly fine up until it crashed. Now, that could either be the graphics card, or it could be this virus-infested version of Windows XP. Honestly, I was sort of amazed it worked. The only other test I went ahead and did was I launched Mount & Blade Warband with the highest possible settings with DirectX 9, and the game just up to its highest settings. And that pretty much ran at a constantly locked 60 FPS. The thing is, though, on Windows XP, having 8 gigs of VRAM is predominantly pointless, because we've taken Mount & Blade Warband, which is quite a late Windows XP game, and also Crysis running as maxed out as possible, and even then it was topping out at around 430 to 500 megabytes of usage, because games back then, well, they didn't really need all of this VRAM. So yes, you can technically now have an 8GB VRAM capable graphics card on Windows XP, but there's not very much you can do with it. Maybe with some kernel extensions and a 64-bit version of Windows XP, you could try and get it closer to that 8GB mark, but I can't see any practical use case when we already struggled to do so on Windows 11. So at the end of the day, yes, this does work on Windows XP. Windows XP does see through the trickery and doesn't display it as a 750 Ti, but also there is little to no reason to do any of this other than to just simply see Windows XP say 8 gigs of VRAM. So there we have it, China's very odd, very exclusive and very hard to get a hold of 750 Ti 8GB. And what are my thoughts? Well, in their local market, I can understand it, because as I've been led to believe by the guy that imports these for me, this is a £30 graphics card. So this is not something that's expensive, this is just something you can buy off the shelf over there that does appear to be good enough to get by, good enough to play a lot of games, and has plenty of VRAM for those that may need it. I'd imagine the VRAM is more of a marketing ploy. Think like the R7 240s you used to get back in the day, and the GT 730s that had come with 4GB of memory rather than 1GB that they actually needed. Sort of like that, but in the modern day, but also a bit less scammy. I mean, yes, they are giving it a name it doesn't actually have, calling it the 750 Ti and having the drivers report that, but at the same time, they have got it clocked high enough out of the box that it does nearly match a normal 750 Ti. When it comes to power consumption at thermals, I did a little bit of testing, but honestly, it's nothing you won't already expect from a GTX 750 or 750 Ti. It tops out around 35 watts in usage when gaming, and generally gets up to about 50 to 60 degrees under a stress test. I think the main takeaway from this, though, is the ingenuity of their home market, that there is enough demand out there for these cheaper, lower-end graphics cards that, of course, don't need any additional power. You can just slot this into any system, as we've just done, even into a Windows XP machine with a Sandy Bridge motherboard, and it works fine. So I kind of get what they're doing here. The ingenuity is amazing. They're essentially offering a rather well-built graphics card. I've done a teardown of it, and yeah, it's a basic PCB, and yeah, it's not exciting, but it's pretty well put together, and they do offer apparently a 2-year warranty back in the Chinese native market. So I do understand this card. At the same time, though, if you're someone here in the West, by the time you've imported it, well, you could go and get an RX 580 or probably even a Vega 56, maybe a 980 Ti or even a GTX 1070, which are all going to be better. I mean, even if you wanted a lower power card, you could still end up with a 1050 or a 1050 Ti cheaper than this. So I understand its purpose in the market. You're probably better off not bothering to get one over here, because if you want a 750 Ti, 4 gigs is plenty, and 2 gigs will also be fine. So if you're desperate for a 750 Ti, maybe don't go for one of these unless you're desperate to have something special. So I hope you've all enjoyed this video. It's been a lot of work to make, as these ones always are, but it's also been a lot of fun. So thank you all for watching, and good night.